I live in Los Angeles and I'm a YouTuber as my full-time job. As a lot of you know, I run the channel Lizzie's Answers. I've been doing YouTube for 10 years. I have 40 million video views, 220,000 subscribers, and I've made over 600 videos in the past 9 years. My channel content has changed so much throughout the years, but currently I talk the most about my experience living with bipolar disorder and my conversion into Catholicism, which was 2 years ago in 2018 Easter Vigil Mass. Thank you, you guys, where I was able to receive the Eucharist for the first time. I stood in front of my entire church, all of my agnostic and Protestant friends, my new parish community, in front of my priest and in front of God, and I said, I believe and profess all that the Holy Catholic Church believes, teaches, and proclaims to be revealed by God. This statement carries so much weight. It was awful becoming Catholic. So much pain and self-denial and betrayal, hurting people I love, dying to self, hundreds of hours of reading and research into church history. I want to start with 2 Bible verses that encompass this entire talk. The first one is from Ecclesiastes 1:18. For in much wisdom is much pain. The Hebrew means mental and physical pain. And those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. So this just means that becoming more aware of the suffering in the world and taking care of other people, that's where wisdom really comes from. The second is my experience struggling through my mental illness. 2 Corinthians 12:7-10. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming prideful, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I grew up my entire life as a Protestant in a church called Churches of Christ, which is an offshoot of Presbyterian. We had a cappella worship, so no instruments, and full immersion baptism. Most people at my churches thought Catholics were going to hell because they were baptized wrong. Sprinkling isn't baptism was a common thing said against Catholics, and because they baptized babies, that wasn't real baptism. I was taught that Catholics worship Mary, worship statues, worship the Pope, that they didn't go by the Bible, and were not Christians. My churches really emphasized going by the Bible and being the early church because the practices of the earliest Christians were closest to Jesus and must be how he intended the church to be. Churches of Christ thought that they were the early church, but this ideology, years and years later, is what caused me to leave COC and become Catholic. My family moved around a lot growing up. I have one older sister, and then I'm the baby of the family. We lived in St. Petersburg, Russia for 5 years because my parents were missionaries there. Once we moved back to the US, we moved every 4 to 5 years, and so I've never really felt at home in the US, and there's nowhere really that is home, except for LA. I've lived here for 6 years, and it's the one place in the country where I feel at home and understood, and like, this is my place. My family's entire social life, I'm so glad you guys are proud to live here too. My family's entire social life was centered around church. We'd go Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, Bible studies at home, youth group. We always connected talking about theology. My parents both went to grad school for theology before becoming missionaries, and my dad has his PhD and is a history professor. So growing up, our entire home was covered in books of Bibles and commentaries, history, philosophy. My parents always really emphasized knowing the faith. There was never a time I remember not knowing God. From when I was 9, I kept a God journal, so I would take sermon notes at church and I would write down prayers and confessions and Bible questions. I called it my God journal. I read my Bible every night, and reading the Psalms taught me how to pray. By the time I finished middle school, I'd read through the entire Bible, except the books of the Bible that the Protestants removed during the Reformation. One of my favorite stories was at the beginning of 2 Chronicles when God asked Solomon to grant him anything in the world. Instead of asking for power or wealth or the perfect relationship, Solomon asked for wisdom. And so starting when I was 11, I prayed for wisdom every single day. And as we read in the Ecclesiastes verse, which was written by King Solomon, God answered those prayers by giving me very painful experiences. When I was 13, we moved to Florida, and this was kind of the loss of innocence in my life because we left a place that was very Christian, where everyone believed in God, to a very secular environment. Even people who identified as Catholic and Jewish were atheists, and I dealt with attacks towards my faith for the first time. But that just forced me to read more philosophy and theology and get into my faith more. So I'm really glad that I lived in Florida, even though I kind of hated Florida and still do a little bit. In 8th grade, I auditioned for an arts high school called Dreyfus School of the Arts, and I got in. I was in the communication arts department, and I studied creative writing, film, and speech and debate. I knew nothing about film going into high school and was actually mad that I was forced to take a film class, but instead I fell in love with Final Cut Pro, which is the editing software that I still use. I never ever thought of being a YouTuber, but one summer after my sophomore year of college, I was really bored. And so I decided to make a YouTube video. And after that, I was never bored again because it takes 40 hours for me to make one video. And now I often work 80-hour weeks. My entire life, I've loved arguing and been so opinionated, especially about religion. So being on the debate team was a natural fit. I did Lincoln Douglas debate, LD, which you guys might have heard of if you guys did debate in high school. Anyone here? No? Okay. Just me then. So it was a philosophical debate. So I started reading philosophy for the first time. We would read Plato and Rousseau and Augustine. It's really where I got into philosophy. But the best part of debate, that is what helped me become Catholic, is for every single tournament, we had to research the affirmative and negative of every topic. So it forced me to want to seek truth and to see every perspective of an issue. One of my absolute favorite quotes of all time is actually my college's mission statement. Truth has nothing to fear from investigation, which means if you are right on an issue, you won't have to change your perspective. But if you're wrong, then to fit with truth, you have to change what you believe. While my high school students, I missed a part. My high school was super atheist, and I faced critique towards my faith for the first time, but that forced me to research so much more. I got in a lot of arguments in class with my teachers, other students, clearing up misconceptions about Christianity and just defending the faith. While my high school was very anti-Christian, it was even more anti-Catholic. I remember learning in history classes that Catholicism was against science, inherently violent, going around causing wars, and very, very oppressive towards people who disagreed with them. Something that always stuck so vividly in my mind was the burning of Juan Hus by the Catholic Church. He was the first Protestant reformer who was just calling out some issues of just immorality in the priesthood, and the Pope decided to burn him to death. From that point on, I hated Catholicism way more than my parents. It wasn't just I disagreed with it, but I saw it as an evil force in the world. I vehemently hated Catholicism. I remember in school laughing about the Catholics not believing that the earth revolves around the sun. A very biased version of the Galileo trial was taught to us. And I also remember laughing about the Eucharist, how they literally believed it physically became Jesus. Crazy. At my Protestant church at the time, it was really sexist. It was a lot more conservative than where we lived in Indiana and Ohio, and women were not allowed to participate in any part of the public worship service. Not leading singing, not reading Bible verses, not even passing the collection plates. We were also not allowed to teach classes that guys were in, or even pray out loud in even a casual setting if there were also men there. I have a vivid memory of when I was 15, I was teaching the 9-year-old class, and there was a boy in the class who had just gotten baptized. And there was a man in our church who walked into the room and yelled at me in front of all the children and said, "You cannot teach this class. There's a baptized boy in the class and you're a woman." As someone who was excelling in debate at the time, winning county tournaments, going to states and nationals, it was infuriating being told that as a woman, I wasn't allowed to talk about my faith or teach about my faith. It pushed me so hard, and that's why I got into YouTube, because I was allowed to talk about my faith on YouTube as a woman. I made a lot of videos talking about, and side note, this is one of the things when people call the Catholic Church sexist or misogynistic for not allowing women to be priests. Like, women can do everything in Catholicism. We can read scripture, be youth ministers, be campus ministers, be scholars, pass the collection plates. Like, women have such a huge role in the Catholic Church, and it's really beautiful. Even me being a speaker, it's something that would have been impossible in my previous church. So for my YouTube channel, I talked a lot about relationships, how to pray, devotionals, arguments for the existence of God. My channel grew and grew, and by my senior year of high school, I had 10,000 subscribers and was uploading twice a week. I would read every single message sent to me by one of my subscribers, and it was actually awful. I cried so much reading through the messages. There were people going through eating disorders, deaths of friends, depression, breakups, parents getting divorced. And I felt like I had the whole weight of the world on me trying to help all these people. So my channel became all about ministering to people who are hurting and leading them to Christ to help them heal. For college, I moved to California and I went to Pepperdine University, which I highly recommend. So if anyone's looking into colleges, we have a lot of amazing Catholic professors there who really influenced me. So Pepperdine is a Church of Christ school, which is the Protestant church that I grew up in. I majored in philosophy and religion. From my first semester freshman year, there was a very bizarre, strange trend going on where there were philosophy students, Church of Christ philosophy students, converting into Catholicism. Now, at my churches growing up, there were loads of ex-Catholics who had become Church of Christ. But never in my life had I met people who were choosing to be Catholic. It made me a little bit uncomfortable. I just thought it was a weird trend. I kept noticing more and more people going through RCIA as I was going through college, but I was so prideful and stubborn at the time, and I thought 0% that Catholicism could be true. Once I got to college, everything in me emotionally flipped like a switch. In high school, I had been scared of vulnerability, not social at all, not having many friends. But once I got to college, I was extremely confident, talking, meeting so many people, flirting with so many guys. Looking back a few years later, my psychiatrist identified that I was in a bipolar manic episode my first year of college and on and off for the past few years. I had a lot of symptoms. I would talk really, really fast, faster than right now, which is called pressured speech. I would live off of 3 or 4 hours of sleep and be uploading content like 20 or 30 hours on YouTube, doing school full time, involved in so many activities, doing ministry, just so much all at once. Because this was my first time meeting everyone I knew at Pepperdine, they just thought this was my actual personality. And so no one thought anything of it. And looking back, I never would have guessed that all of those symptoms would be a mental illness. I grew so close to God during this time, almost like I was spiritually sprinting. Pepperdine is so spiritually rich. People of all different denominations coming together and loving each other. There were so many Bible studies, lectures, worship services. Hyper spirituality is also part of bipolar. And so I would go through times where 2 or 3 hours, I would just be out in nature, praying to God. These spiritual highs of feeling so attuned spiritually, seeing all these spiritual metaphors in the world, feeling like I'm on a whole different realm, a whole different connection above other people to God. It's mania. 2 of my favorite professors at Pepperdine were Catholics, and unfortunately, Catholic converts. One from being Lutheran and one from being atheist. They were both my favorite professors, and so it made me really uncomfortable, just like all my other friends who were converting in. Because Pepperdine is a Protestant university, in the religion department, there can only be Church of Christ professors, but in philosophy, English, great books, political science, there were a lot of Catholic professors. And so for classes, I was reading Augustine and Aquinas and Dante. I was being assigned Peter Van Wagen, C.C. Pecknold, and I didn't realize until years later that a lot of these thinkers were Catholics. And I even felt kind of manipulated by my professors that secretly they were trying to influence everyone. We learned the history of the Middle Ages from these Catholic professors, something that had been completely left out of my college's humanities courses, my church history class, and all of my history classes in public school growing up. I have a story that epitomizes this so well. So my boyfriend just got his MDiv from a Protestant university, and he was in his church history class, and they finished learning about the church councils in the 4th century. And then the teacher announces, next week, we're going to be learning about the Protestant Reformation. 1,000 years skipped. There was a girl in the class who just gotten a degree in medieval history at another school, and my boyfriend said that her face looked so aghast and shocked and offended that they would completely skip over 1,000 years. But our philosophy department was the same. We learned about Plato, Aristotle, and then jumped forward to the 1800s Enlightenment. So Catholic history is completely left out of a lot of public school, a lot of Protestant religion departments. As I was taking my religion classes in college by my Church of Christ professors, there were a lot of breadcrumbs of truth that were gradually leading me away from Catholic theology. The first one had to do with my Greek class. I took 2 years of Koine Greek in college, which is the language of the New Testament, and we were learning the etymology of the word faith. Pistis is faith, and pisteuo means I believe. So we learned that faith is not an intellectual assent to an idea. It's not just believing a premise that God exists, but it's an action word. It's entrusting your actions to God, which is completely different than how I was taught growing up. I remember asking my professor in class if this affected our theology, misunderstanding faith. And he said no, but I was not convinced. I also remember reading the Epistle of James at the time, just on my own, and it had this vivid language about how faith without works is dead. It stops being faith. St. Paul talks about this in Philippians 2:12, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Faith is entrusting actions to God. There's no dichotomy between faith and works, like the Protestant Reformation tried to convince so many people. Faith means dying for the gospel in the face of persecution. Faith means giving away our money to help the poor. Faith means sacrificing time from studying to help a friend who's hurting. Faith means defending someone who your friends are gossiping about. And in my case, faith means damaging my relationship with my family to follow the truths of the Catholic Church. The second breadcrumb of truth that I learned in my Protestant religion class was the reason that the early Christians were persecuted. So the two reasons that the early Christians were persecuted were because they were accused of being atheists and cannibalists. So atheists because they were denying the pagan gods, but cannibalism really confused me. It was just bizarre. So a couple years later, when I was learning more about the Catholic view of the Eucharist, it clicked. They were being called cannibalists because the early church fathers, starting in the 1st century, were talking about the Eucharist in an extremely literal manner. Number 3, breadcrumb of truth, is when I stopped believing in sola scriptura my junior year of college. And at this point, I 0% thought Catholicism could be true and had no idea that I was veering in that direction. But one of my Catholic professors looked me in the eye in the middle of class and said, "Tradition created the Bible, so you can't have the Bible without tradition." In that moment, it clicked. For the first 400 years, they didn't have the Bible as a total canon. Churches would have different bits of the Bible, but they didn't have the entire Bible. So you can have the church without the Bible, but you can't have the Bible without the church. Until my junior year at Pepperdine, I had always seen tradition in such a negative light, man-made tradition. But for the first time, I was becoming open to the idea that tradition are the gospel writers and St. Paul and St. Peter and the early church fathers. It's not just things being made up thousands of years later. I spent each summer while I was in college doing missions work in Bangkok, Thailand. It was through a Church of Christ organization called Let's Start Talking, and it was the most amazing ministry model I've ever seen in my life. It was teaching English with the Bible with college students. So we just read through the Gospel of Luke, a chapter at the time, and we would translate it with them, do punctuation, pronunciation, and then ask content questions about what the gospel meant to them, how they were interacting with it. So I saw so many people be baptized, come to know Christ through my time in Thailand. And my second year, I decided that, like my parents, I also wanted to be a missionary. And so I committed to that church that after graduating college, I would move there and live there for 3 to 5 years, maybe indefinitely. I absolutely loved Thai culture. I was learning Thai, and I still think and dream in Thai. It became so embedded in my psyche. This was the most heartbreaking part of my conversion, me choosing truth over people I love who were like friends and family to me. It was the most insurmountable thing to process, that God wanted me to emphasize intellectual truth and choose that over people who I love. I remember in 2017, one of my subscribers sent me a picture of the Eucharist on an altar and said, "This is the most important thing above any person." And that ended up being what I chose. I try and not think about Thailand without crying. I've talked for hours about my whole experience in YouTube videos, but I see pictures on Facebook of my friends there and everything that the church is doing, and I feel so guilty because in becoming Catholic, I betrayed them. I continued my YouTube channel all throughout college, posting once or twice a week, and my channel kept growing and growing, and I was sharing everything I was learning in my religion classes as my YouTube content, helping so many people. Halfway through my junior year of college, I started feeling extremely exhausted all the time. I had these super vivid dreams every night, and regardless of how much sleep I got, it could be 8, 12, 15 hours, I would still wake up feeling exhausted. I started losing interest in my classes, and it was so difficult to concentrate during lectures, to think of things to say during class discussions. It was so hard to process what I was reading in my classes. It is like similar to having mono, but I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. There was nothing bad going on in my life at the time, but just this switch that had turned on another part of my mental illness. It took 2 months for any medication to kick in and alleviate the symptoms, and by that point, the semester was ruined. I failed every class, and it was so almost torturous that semester, being surrounded by academia and all of these classes I should have loved and been flourishing in. But I was within that with a weak, slowed down, broken brain. The worst part is that a lot of my friends and family and professors, pretty much everyone but my therapist, didn't believe I had depression and told me I was making it up. Meanwhile, I was having thoughts of ending my life. It was so hard to just get out of bed, to shower, to eat meals. A year later, my senior year at Pepperdine, I was told that my diagnosis was wrong and that I actually have bipolar disorder, that the major depressive episode was just one half of a mental illness. I barely graduated college because of the depression, and by the end, I didn't even care about graduating college. I just wanted to be out of this place that represented my brain being broken and just hating being in academia. Because of the way my family is, being so intellectual and reading all the time and talking about ideas, I'd based so much of my identity in intellectualism. And so having that torn away from me just within a couple months, it was like losing this huge part of myself. That summer after college is when I stopped believing in God. Almost. It was the time of the Orlando shooting, and the day before the Orlando shooting, there was a YouTuber, Christina Grimmie, who I'd been watching for years, who was murdered after her show. There were a few other tragedies going on at the time, and after being in a depression episode for a year and feeling so abandoned by God, it was just impossible to believe that God would allow so much evil and suffering to happen. And in my Protestant churches at the time, people would just say cliche things like, God will never give you more than you can handle. God has a plan for your life. God will bring good out of evil. And telling someone suffering all of that, it doesn't help at all. It wasn't until I learned the Catholic theology of uniting our sufferings with Christ that the evil I was experiencing began to make sense. The next year, at the beginning of 2017, I had a last straw moment. Another one of my Pepperdine friends confessed to me that he was converting into Catholicism. And this time it was someone who had been a religion grad student at Pepperdine who was now in another program also studying Christianity. My friends who were philosophy majors didn't know as much about church history, but here was someone who'd spent the past 8 years studying Christianity. How could they find the church to be true? I have a vivid memory being in my bedroom and grabbing a church history book that I had on my bookshelf. I'd bought it for a paper I'd been writing in one of my religion classes, but only used the first 2 chapters. So I turned to the first page of chapter 3, and it uses the term monarchical bishop, that in the first century, there were monarchical bishops leading the church. And then sharing all this evidence in the 2nd century of priests being part of the church. And I thought back to Church of Christ being the early church with deacons and elders. And I realized that the Catholic and Orthodox churches are the ones that still have this leadership structure. It was shocking to me, and it really, really, really scared me. For the first time, I was 1% open to Catholicism being true. From that point on, I got addicted to researching more and more and more and more. I'd finish my YouTube work for the day and then be up till 2, 3 in the morning, reading just primary documents of the church fathers on 2 websites. One is called earlychristianwritings.com. It just has everything in chronological order. And another website called New Advent. It just has all of these resources of everything the church doctors and church fathers believe. The first thing that was really caving for me was believing in the Eucharist. I used my Greek knowledge from college and I read in Protestant lexicons. A lexicon is like defining different ancient words based upon other literature at the time and other verses in the Bible. So it's like a dictionary. And in these Protestant commentaries, it looked at the word that Jesus uses for eat my flesh, trogon. It's only used 6 times in the entire New Testament. And there are so many different words for eat in Greek. There's like a dozen words for different types of eating. Like if you're talking about eating up an idea as a metaphor, there's a word for that. There's a word for dining in the morning. There's a words for other metaphorical uses of eat. But trogon was an extremely literal word to describe an animal crunching and munching and audibly eating and gnawing on raw vegetables and plants. I also read St. Ignatius at the time talking about the Eucharist extremely literally in the 1st century when the Apostle John was still alive. I read other excerpts of church fathers and I read the communion accounts one after another where Jesus says, "Take, eat. This is my body. This is my blood." And it was actually the night before Easter. And I remember reading all of this all at once at night and just crying and crying. And I messaged my Catholic convert friends and I said, I'm going to become Catholic or Orthodox. From that point on, I got addicted to more and more research, and I started attending Orthodox Divine Liturgy and Latin Mass every single week for 7 months. Seeing the icons and all the church art and the incense in Divine Liturgy and in Byzantine Catholicism, it brought all the stories of the Bible alive and so vivid in a way I never experienced before. Seeing the icons of the apostles and John the Baptist and Mary and all these other church fathers throughout the years, just being surrounded by them. It was just this idea of bringing heaven to earth. And without anyone even telling me, I knew that the Mass was earth and heaven coming together. Based upon all my research, I uploaded a YouTube video called 13 Lies Protestants Believe About Catholics, which is how a lot of my new subscribers found my channel. I was infuriated. I felt like I'd been lied to my entire life by my churches growing up, my parents, my college professors, because all of this was so obvious and so there, but I'd been trained and lied to hate Catholicism and to never even consider that it could be true. It felt like I was adopted against my will, kidnapped against my will, away from my true mother into another church, and then lied to my whole life about who she is so that I would hate her. Because of this YouTube video, it went sort of viral, and within one night, I started getting hundreds and thousands of comments and messages and emails, and my subscribers, my old subscribers and new subscribers started sending me so much research and readings and arguments and YouTube lectures to watch. And they tried to convert me into Catholicism. On the video, so many people would comment, "Welcome home to Rome in advance. She's a future Catholic." And so many people, the most infuriating, they said that I'm praying to Mary and asking her to intercede for you to become Catholic. Because I believed in the Eucharist, it pulled me through all the other hardest teachings I had to accept. As a feminist, accepting the no birth control teaching, I saw immediately as misogynistic and sexist and wanting to keep women from higher education, all of this bias you pick up in the country. And that teaching and the teaching You're looking at my YouTube video. Thank you for supporting my channel. Oh my gosh. The sexuality teachings were particularly difficult, but I actually Skyped with some of my subscribers and we would debate each other and they would explain things to me. And all the teachings on Mary were obviously the hardest ones. I remember the perpetual virginity of Mary, just laughing at one of my subscribers who tried to convince me of this. I was like It talks about Jesus' brothers and sisters in the New Testament. How can you say she was a virgin her whole life and he didn't have siblings? And then I used my Greek knowledge again and learned that the Greek word for brother and sister is also the word for cousin. So easy. And Mary is amazing. She super helped me become Catholic. So during this time, it was not all joy. I was actually so sad and heartbroken to leave my church I had grown up in, and I was most terrified, horrified, so scared to tell my parents what I had been finding out. I hadn't told them anything because I was terrified that they would react with so much anger. I remember crying so much because I knew that God was forcing me to hurt my parents so much by me becoming a Catholic. And there were so many times where I prayed that the next day I would wake up and none of this would be true because it was too painful to process. When I finally told my parents in November that I was becoming Catholic, I'd already been an RCIA for a few months. I sent them a 15-page Microsoft Word document explaining in depth all of my arguments for why Catholicism is true. And my dad took a week to respond to me, and he responded for him and my mom with another 15-page document. And he said that this news was akin to me having been in a horrible car accident and in the ICU in the emergency room about to die, because he saw me as no longer being a Christian and my faith being in jeopardy. He did a lot of ad hominem arguments, calling me emotional and manipulated and non-intellectual. As someone who had formed me intellectually my entire life, it was so painful having these attacks by my dad and having him not understand what I was going through, having no one in my family understanding it. I can't even emphasize how hurtful it was hurting my parents like this. They're the closest people to my life, and it was the first time that they had ever stopped talking to me. It was a couple months where my dad wouldn't talk to me at all. I would talk to my mom on the phone, and then she would make up some excuse for why he wouldn't talk to me. I even developed sort of disordered eating at the time because I just felt so guilty and heartbroken and awful for hurting them. And I felt like if I didn't eat as much, it would almost balance out and make it better. It was so toxic. That Christmas was awful, the Christmas of 2017. It was so tense and awkward, and we got in some awful conversations, and my family felt broken, and it was my fault. I'd broken my family. Fast forward, it was Ash Wednesday, a month before my confirmation, and things were finally starting to get better with my family. I felt like I'd been lying to my YouTube subscribers, though, because I'd been making all these Catholic videos and be like, 5 reasons Mary was a perpetual virgin as a Protestant, just a lot of videos like that. And I finally wanted to come clean and talk about my conversion, but I was really scared to, because I'd been doing YouTube for 8 years at that time, making Protestant Christian videos, and it was my income source, and I was scared that I would lose my job essentially because I would lose so many subscribers. So in March of 2018, I uploaded the video, Why I'm Becoming Catholic, and thank you guys. And it blew up. It became a viral Catholic news story. EWTN promoted me, and overnight I had hundreds of emails and messages to do interviews and book deals and speaking engagements. And it was this so wild time because I felt so loved and accepted and known by thousands of Catholics, all these new people coming to my YouTube channel. But it was a time where, for the second time, my parents stopped talking to me, because they hated how I had made public to all of our friends and family and church members that I had left the church. My parents felt like a failure that I had left Church of Christ. At my confirmation 2 years ago, when I received my first communion, I felt no emotion. I felt numb and apathetic. At a time when I should have felt so much joy, I was confused because I was in a major depressive episode. But as I received real presence communion for the first time and processed what it meant, I felt extreme comfort that it no longer depends on how or what I feel, but that Jesus being physically part of me in the Eucharist and a part of everyone else at Mass, it supersedes and overcomes whatever I'm going through. I want to read back the verse I read at the beginning from 2 Corinthians. Therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. For Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And to finish the verse from Ecclesiastes 1:18, for in much wisdom is much pain, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. Now we're going to go into a prayer session, so let's prepare ourselves and be open to let God into our hearts.